This one was with policy exchange. I'm just going to read a little bit from the abstract before you elaborate, if that's all right. So, modeling three scenarios, we find that the combination of continued low birth rates and the aging population could result in a significant increase in government spending, an increase that would require an increase in taxation equivalent to a rise in the average rate of income tax by 7.4 percentage points. Contrary to some suggestions, even ongoing levels of high net migration, say 600,000 a year, drop in the bucket, would not compensate for low birth rates and would still leave a spending gap equivalent to an increase in the average rate of income tax by 4.1 percentage points. Only an increase in the birth rate to above replacement rate, and we'll talk about among who in a moment, will mitigate the impact of the aging population, leaving only a small demographic pressure that could be readily mitigated and overcome by improved economic growth, increased public sector productivity, good luck, or other efficiencies. Do you mind elaborating on that modelling?
Okay, can I start with what you said before the paper? Because I think your audience really needs to hear this. This is the thing that's been bouncing around kind of right-wing conservative British circles for the past year now, which is about net contributions by immigrants. And I'm not saying this to make the OBR's case for them. I disagree with the OBR's case. We're writing papers about it. But I'm making this case because you have to understand, the right has to understand the argument that the OBR is making. If an immigrant is taking money from the public system, which they are, all those memes that you see on Twitter are correct. I don't know the exact numbers, but let's call it about 5 grand a year. Okay, it's somewhere in that ballpark. They are adding to public spending and therefore the public debt load by net 5 grand a year. The issue is that they are adding GDP. Now, how much does each immigrant add? Roughly the average salary plus the average profit, right? That's roughly what it is. So call it average salary of an immigrant. Let's be super conservative, 20K a year. It's probably a bit more than that. And then the profits on top of that, 7K. Okay, call it 25K all in. If 25K is more than the 5K that they're mooching off the system, it still gets the public debt ratio down because it's debt to GDP. So if the denominator debt goes up slower than the numerator GDP, then it's okay. Okay, net contribute. That is the OBR's argument. So I really think that the people who are opposing immigration on economic grounds need to understand that. That is basically what we're looking at in this paper. We're saying, okay, of course, that's true. On balance, to keep the economy ticking over with these low birth rates, you're from a purely GDP point of view, from a purely fiscal stability point of view, you're better off with the immigrants than not. But what we're also showing is that the model's not sustainable. You've just said it. By whatever it is, 2080 or whatever we did, it's 7 point something percent to the average income tax. Well, and that means that if you're paying about 30% of your income in tax right now, or 35%, you're paying like 42%, right? And that doesn't even take into account the fact that there's already a massive fiscal deficit. They're going to have to increase taxes anyway. Rachel Reeves they're probably going to get her to do it and then throw her out after she does it in the next year. So that's on top of those issues. The only way to get it under control is to get birth rates back to normal. Now, two caveats to that. Well, two related caveats to that. First of all, even if we got back to replacement birth rates tomorrow, back to 2.1 tomorrow, those babies, I hate to say, aren't going to work for a while. Sadly, I'm joking, we can't send the 8-year-old up the chimney anymore. And we probably don't want to go back to that, although, so you're going to have to wait for them to be of working age. Call that 16, okay? So you're going to have to wait 16 years. You're not going to get that labor force growth until 16 years from the moment you get the birth rate back up. So we should have been talking about this years ago. We can talk about why economists ignored this and so on until it became, an actual live problem, but they did. And we should have been talking about this 20 years ago. Related to that is that in the interim between the getting the birth rate up and pumping out 16-year-olds out the other end of the pipe, which is amazingly 16 years later, it's amazing how the maths works here. Um, in between that, you have to spend more. You actually have to spend more public money. You have to spend on education. You have to spend on any family benefits that you're going to do to get the birth rate up and so on. So what you see is a kind of a hilly, squiggly graph of spending. And what this means, it's really important for people to understand, is that there's a massive incentive for policymakers not to do this and to rely on immigration instead. Because the immigration in the short term lowers what I said, the debt to GDP ratio. When you bring in that immigrant, the moment he takes a job and the moment his PAYE receipts come in and the moment his working at Starbucks or whatever is adding to GDP, he's bringing down the pressure on the public finances. Whereas if they go with the natalist argument, we're saying you're going to have to stomach higher spending for the next 16 years before you see any results. Now, the only results that actually work long term and make the country like prosperous, stable, etc., not just from a demographics point of view, from an economic point of view, are the higher birth rates. But there's every incentive to just keep bringing in the immigrants until, of course, there aren't enough immigrants to come in because the economy isn't good enough.
So I'll get on to the reason why the economists have been curiously silent on this long term fiscal and demographic issue in a moment. But on the GDP case, is it really as simple as we bring in an extra person, there are more economic transactions, therefore the line goes up? Because I noticed a curious statement in the brief for Rachel Reeves's budget, which was, and I'm going to condense this down and not quote directly, but the previous government thought that if we knocked parts of public sector spending off every single year, improved efficiency, brought taxes down over time, then we would have greater GDP and lower the debt, because at the moment it's roughly 100% jet GDP. Quote, this government takes a different approach, and went on to say that increasing public sector spending will itself increase GDP. So that means if you bring in net dependents, the government is going to spend money on those net dependents. That's an economic transaction. Therefore, it's factored into the GDP sheet. And if GDP is going up, that means that you've got more room to borrow. And if you're borrowing, you can then say we're going to meet our entitlements in how many years down the line when NHS and social care bills from an aging population come due. Is it really that simple? Have I missed something?
I think it's even simpler again. They're not targeting it's not so much the tax receipts of the immigrants that are of concern to the bean counters and Treasury, OBR, and the central bank. It is the GDP that they add. Markets, when they judge how manageable a country's debt load is, you said 100% of GDP, that's what they're looking at. If you can continue to borrow if the GDP line goes up even faster and you get down to 98, 98, 99, 98%, you see what I'm saying? So what the immigrant does is, yes, of course, on balance, they're probably costing 5 grand or something like that, but they're adding 25K the year that they arrive to the GDP, and that stabilizes the debt. Now, what you're doing at the same time is growing government, of course, because you're having more net dependence. So you're building in all these nasties into the system. But I'm saying that if you're a bureaucrat in the OBR and you're looking at debt to GDP ratio, which is the short-term variable that all the economic institutions in Britain and other countries look at because they don't want to face a borrowing crisis. And that's what markets are looking at too. That's what S&P, ratings agencies, Fitch, all them are looking at. If you're completely focused on that variable, it sets up an incentive system to bring in immigrants. It just does. And until we can get away from that, that is the incentive system. Now, it's not that easy to get away from because the markets are watching too. And we've already had some shakiness in the British bond market. It's very unstable. So Britain's particularly badly placed to deal with this, as are some European countries. But I just say, look, the bean counters screwed up big time here. They got us to this point. They should have noticed this 20, 25 years ago. It should have been a pretty obvious problem, actually. And they should have seen what the culture was doing to birth rates. All that said, they're not really doing anything nefarious per se. They're focusing on the key issue of them being able to issue public debt, which Britain currently issues a lot of, into the markets, and they're saying we have to maintain selling that public debt because if we don't, well, we're going to have a fiscal crisis, potentially a monetary crisis, and the country might end up in receivership in the IMF. So that's pretty much the incentive structure that's set up for the Troika, the central bank, the Treasury, and the OBR.
Thank you for watching that clip from Tomlinson Talks. If you liked that and you would like to see more, you can get the full 90-minute show every week on a Wednesday afternoon, live from 3 p.m. only on lotuseaters.com, and all of the other content that my colleagues produce behind the paywall for as little as £5 a month. Thank you very much for supporting us, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.